Well, hello everybody. Thanks for being here on day 2 of Automation Dreamin. My name is Evan Ponter, and this is one flow versus multiple flows. Which runs faster? Every time anybody ever gets in a conversation about flows, this question comes up. And there's been a lot of debate around how we should organize our flows, our record triggered automation. So I want to take a stab at trying to answer that question today by doing some performance testing, showing you the data that I've accumulated, and talking through the different configurations and what might be recommended in certain situations. I am positive we will not close the book on this conversation today. So I just wanted to add to the discourse and sort of think about this from a data perspective, which has been done before, but I'm putting my own twist on it here today. If you have questions, please pop them into the chat. You certainly have lots of questions. Don't be shy. Put those there. I want to see what is on people's minds. This is the first time I've given this presentation, so any feedback at all about the way I should structure it, things I should look at, I am all ears. So please let me know what you think. A little bit about me. I am an independent Salesforce consultant based in Baltimore, Maryland in the United States. The first time I logged into Salesforce was in 2012. I've worked for-profit and nonprofit Salesforce customers. I slipped into the world of consulting late in 2019 and became a full-time independent Salesforce consultant in April of 2020. Let's take a look at what we're getting into today. What I wanted to test was, with the same outcomes being achieved, should record triggered flow automation be organized into a single flow or into separate flows? And when I say should, sometimes people ask, is it harder, better, faster, stronger? You fill in the adjective that makes best sense. So, in order to do this testing, I had to come up with a methodology and try to do this a little bit scientifically. So for every one of the scenarios I was testing, I sort of wanted to do the worst case scenario, where somebody was bulk creating records from data loader or something similar. So every one of these scenarios is inserting a batch of 200 records, and all of the automation set up to satisfy multiple requirements. The criteria would be met to run all of them. And that'll make more sense when we get into the examples. But basically, we need multiple things to happen when 200 records are inserted into the system. I am capturing the CPU time immediately before and immediately after I insert those records. So here's what it looks like in the script that I'm running in the execute anonymous window. I capture that CPU time right before I insert the records, then I capture the time right after. Then I save those results to a record in a custom object. I'll show you the developer org where I've got all this set up. I have a bunch of records for all the results. They're called benchmark result records, and I'm simply just saving the data there so we can visualize it and do some analysis. A little bit of caveat on the results. I wanted to include things like how many DML statements were consumed and how many SOQL queries were run. And I didn't want that to impact the timings, so I ended up just doing a pre-test run with some debug statements turned on so that I could figure out how many DML statements and SOQL queries were being used. Once I got those numbers, I sort of just hard-coded them into the new benchmark result record that I was creating. While I was running the test, I was very specific to turn all debug logs off. We didn't want any of that logging to impact the timings of how long it would take to create these records. I would run each script 32 times. I learned in my high school statistics class that you cannot have a population of data until you have at least crossed 30 results. So I would run it 32 times so that I could eliminate the highest and the lowest result, assuming those are outliers. Very bold assumption on my part. So that's the data we're going to be looking at is 30 times we run this script, what is the average and what is the median timings that it would, length of time it would take to insert those records with these various flow configurations turned on. A lot of what I did as far as methodology was based on Luke Freeland's work. He's done a couple different blog posts on this topic where he's been benchmark testing flows versus Apex versus workflow rules versus process builder. So I'm going to put his blog into the chat. It is definitely worth a read if you're interested in this topic. He has a package out there so you can recreate his configuration in your own org if you're interested in doing that. I was a big fan. I read through that blog article. I also watched some of the videos from Dan Appelman, which Luke links to, all about this topic of trying to benchmark different configurations in Salesforce. If you have any questions about the methodology or recommendations, please put that into the chat. I would love to hear about it. As far as the setup for the different objects I needed, I set up a developer edition org, and I created 4 custom objects. 3 of them are to facilitate the scenarios that we want to test. So I have a scenario object that just describes it a little bit with the test code that I'm going to run for that scenario. Then I have a configuration object, so I can set up different configurations that will test that scenario. This is where I'm going to do a configuration for one flow and then a separate configuration for multiple flows. The results object is where I'm dumping the results of each script run into the database, and I link it to the configuration so that we can start to visualize these results. Now, the 4th object I created was called benchmark test. That is the object where I've actually set up the flow automation to run on. I wanted something completely separate that's not linked to any other structure. It had to be a custom object, so it's sort of isolated in its own world. And the only automation I have turned on is the configuration that I'm testing. So you'll see there's a number of just dummy fields here, so we can say, oh, if this requirement 1 is true, I want to put a result into result 1 using automation. Silly stuff, but just something that was totally separate from all the other objects. So let's get into it. The first scenario I wanted to test was, should you organize your before save flows into one massive flow or separate out your flows into multiple before save flows when you have multiple requirements you need to solve? So in this fictitious world, there are 5 different departments. They all have a requirement for updating a field on a record as it's created. You could configure that using this one massive flow, or you could separate each requirement into its own flow. Now, I tried to make things very fair in both situations. If I needed a formula in one of the scenarios, I would set up the same formula in all of the flows so that we're not looking at the impact of using formulas versus hard-coded static text. So let me walk you through a little bit of what each of these flows looks like before we get into the results here. Here's my org benchmarking app that I've set up with my scenarios, and my first one is we're going to update 5 fields on the triggering record during insert to test before save flows to see how we should organize them. My one before save flow looks like this. Start element has entry conditions. Because I needed that in my separate flows, I wanted to make sure we were consistent and did that in all situations. So this automation set up on the benchmark test only when a record is created, and if any one of those checkbox fields for do a requirement is equal to true, I want this flow to run. And I'm running this in fast field updates, so it runs before save. Each one of these decisions is simply checking that checkbox field to see if it's equal to true. If so, it routes to the left side and it will assign a value to the triggering record. Result 1 is going to equal result 1 value. I used a formula here to keep things very consistent based on some of the other configurations that I was going to be testing. So if the record's checkbox is equal to true, put some static text for the first result. Otherwise, I want to put whatever value is already in that field. If you saw my session yesterday, this will look very familiar, and this will all make sense when we get to the results, why I'm setting it up this way. But I, again, wanted to be very consistent across the different configurations. So they all have the same formula in place to set the value for that field. Repeat that 4 other times. They all are exactly the same, just setting the value of the subsequent fields based on its respective checkbox. For the multiple flows, there are 5 flows. If you look at my tabs across the top here, each one has entry conditions. Again, benchmark test, record is created. Each one only checks for the checkbox that it cares about. So if do requirement 1 equals true, we're going to run this flow optimized for fast field updates. The only thing we need on this canvas is assigning a value to the triggering record. I don't have any filter conditions here. I set result 1 equal to a formula that has the same structure we just looked at. So, what do you think is going to run faster? Will it be the one flow, or will it be the multiple flows? Now, before we start talking about milliseconds, I do want to show you how fast both of these configurations are. There's absolutely no perceivable difference between these two. We are splitting hairs at this point. Let me show you what the results I got were. I ran each of those 32 times, eliminated the highest and lowest outliers, and here's what I got. In order to set a baseline, I also tested running this script without any of the automation turned on so that I could understand how long does it take normally for Salesforce to save 200 records. That came out to an average of 52 milliseconds, or a median of 53. I have all the data down here at the bottom if you're interested in that. These before save flows don't run any SOQL queries. They don't consume any extra DML statements aside from, I am inserting records in my script, but the flow itself does not have any additional DML statements. Our one before save flow scenario is right here, coming in at an average of 203 milliseconds, whereas our 5 before save flows are slightly above that at 216. Now, let me show you how fast milliseconds are. So I set up this fiddle to show you the difference between 52 milliseconds, 203, and 216. So watch in this area. I've never done this on a screen share, so I'm not quite sure how it'll come across, but don't blink. Are you ready? Did you see it? The text appeared for how long it took each of those flow configurations to run. I'll do it again. All of these configurations are insanely fast. I'll do it one more time in case you didn't see it. We are literally splitting hairs as far as which one is better. Now you'll notice I have a third configuration here that I was testing. Spoiler alert, entering the conversation is a way to optimize your single before save flow. We saw that it was marginally faster. Now, could we make it even better by consolidating some of the elements on the screen? So I wanted to test what I showcased yesterday in my fantastic frameworks for fast feature filled flows. And I set up a single before save flow that has a single assignment element to set values on the triggering record, and I used formulas to set those fields. And where that came in, as far as the timings, is a little bit more significant to set up your flows that way, performance-wise. Here's our baseline at 52. It takes approximately twice that in order to have one of these flows set up. But you can see the difference here that it is a little bit better than doing one before say flow with a bunch of decisions, or separating everything out into 5 before say flows with entry conditions. Let me run this fiddle one more time so you can see how all of those compare to each other. Our baseline is on top. Our one before say flow with a single element is second, and then our one flow with decisions is third, and our multiple flows is fourth. Here we go. So that's what we found. This is the data I have on before say flows. It does support everything I showcased on yesterday's session. And for now, personally, I am going to stick with fewer elements on the canvas and using formulas. I did do some subsequent testing on the impact of formulas versus static text. I'll have to get some data to show you, but from what I remember, there is a marginal impact there, but it's nothing significant. It's definitely less than the baseline here of how long it takes to normally save a record. So you will see a bump in performance time by adding formulas, but the net result of consolidating your flows into fewer elements and using formulas, I think outweighs some of those performance impacts of using formulas in the first place. Okay, yes, there's a question about updating only 1 or 2 checkboxes versus all 5. I do want to get into those scenarios for my next round of testing to understand the impact of no op decisions versus entry criteria, run like not having to run a flow at all. So I think there's a lot of interesting scenarios to get into there where maybe we're only meeting a couple of the requirements, not all 5. Maintainability and quickly understand what a flow is doing. Yes, I have heard of that consideration before. I think in any of these configurations, if you truly want to understand what's happening, you are going to need to open up some of the elements. Even something that has everything on the canvas, sure, you could name it things that might be a little more obvious at this level, but you kind of need to understand what's happening inside of here to know what's going on. And then you have, multiple elements to work with, a lot of, if-then logic to look at. And what I'm proposing here with one before say flow that uses formulas, things are pretty straightforward. You need to evaluate when does this flow launch. So take a look at your entry conditions. You need to understand which fields are going to be updated. They're all listed right here. And then you need to understand what is the value being assigned to each one. So I would just open up the relevant formula to understand that. And depending on what I'm debugging, I can narrow down my search to those 3 areas. And it's not been unwieldy in my experience to do so. That is my opinion. You're certainly welcome to disagree and do your own thing based on what you feel is best for you and your organization. Let me get into some of the after save flows that I was testing. For these after save flows, I wanted to do something where there are 4 requirements. 2 of them are creating a record. They might need to be evaluated independently. And the other 2 are updating an existing record so that we could bring in some create DML statements as well as some queries and some update DML statements. So I've done a very similar thing to what I did in the before save flows and set up a flow that has decisions. And then I set up 4 independent flows that simply have the action that needs to be executed. And we tested those 2 things. Now, similar to how I was also looking for a way to consolidate the one flow to hopefully find a more optimal configuration, I did a couple other things. And there's absolutely a lot of different ways to set up these after save flows to accomplish the same outcome. But what I did in this version here was try to consolidate the create statements and eliminate one of those DML statements by using a collection. Similarly, when I did the update records, I tried to use one query, then loop through the results, assign new values, and then do my commit back to the database as a single update records. I also wanted to compare that to, well, what if you did similar things to what you see on the left, but in separate flows, where you focus each flow on the action that it's executing. So we have a total of 4 scenarios we're testing here. All of them are very similar as far as the action that they accomplish at the end. I'll walk you through one of them so you can understand what's happening here. Here's our one after save flow. It has entry conditions, same as what we were looking at before. I'm checking to see if any of those do requirement checkboxes are equal to true. These flows are optimized for actions and related records. Within each decision here, I would check to see if one of the checkboxes was true. This one's do requirement 1, and that would route directly to an action to create a record in the database. This would create one with the same name as my test record, and result 1 would be equal to a formula. That formula is, if the checkbox is true, then put the first result into that brand new record. Same idea for requirement 2, creating a record if that checkbox is true, and we're simply setting result 2 equal to the result 2 value formula over here, which is the second result. For the updates, I wanted to simply find the 2 records I created above to make things simpler. So over here, I'm saying if that requirement 3 checkbox is equal to true, then I'm going to update a record in the system. This is using a query to go find a record where result 1 is the first result, that the name equals the same as the benchmark test record I created, and then I'm setting the value of result 3 to the result 3 value. And that is over here, which basically will always evaluate to true. Again, these scenarios are assuming what is the absolute worst situation we could get into where all of the automation needs to run, which is why I set it up this way. The fourth one is exactly the same. It's just setting the result 4 field to the fourth result. In the separate flows that I set up for this, all I did here was just narrow down each entry condition to the one checkbox it's interested in. It's optimized for actions and related records, and it goes ahead and executes that single action. Same as before. For the other 2 configurations I was looking at, I was really just trying to use collections here to eliminate one of the DML statements, one of the create statements here. So I would assign values to a record variable, add it to a collection, then I would check the second requirement. If that was true, add that record to a collection, and then decide if I need to create records. Basically, if either one of those first 2 requirements there's records to create in my collection variable. Down here, I was consolidating the query. Instead of having 2 separate ones, I wanted to have a single query. So this will look for records that meet all of this criteria, and then we loop through them and assign new values accordingly for results 3 and 4. Once we have all of those results, I go ahead and commit those changes back to the database using this collection. Then the last configuration I tested was doing the same thing that we just looked at, but in 2 separate flows so that we could eliminate some of the decisions, because we know that if we're doing, requirements 1 and 2, we're going to go ahead and create those records. We don't have to check if we're going to need to create them. Similarly over here, as long as we found results, we can go ahead and update them. So those are the different configurations for the after save flows. I have that all mapped out here. I have the script that I ran 30 times for each of those configurations in order to figure out which one of these is faster. So let's take a look at the results on the dashboard over here. I kept the baseline of no active automation in just for reference, so you know there's about 52 milliseconds of time it takes for Salesforce to create 200 records. What we found here was our one after save flow that has 4 decisions, 4 data elements, and 4 formulas came out to be the fastest solution here. It's not as big a difference as some of these other configurations. In fact, what I was trying to do with consolidating actions into collections ended up taking longer. Now, I have a couple thoughts about that once we get to the end here, but this is the raw data I found when comparing those 4 different configurations. Similarly, I want to show you how fast all of these things are and relative to each other. So I can update this to show you that. This will be 966. Do 1005 here. We'll do 1131 and 1155. So watch this part of the screen. Here's how those different configurations compare to each other. You'll see the text flash for how long it took each of those configurations to run. They all start at the same time and they'll end accordingly. Again, that first one is the baseline of how long it takes to insert 200 records. The remaining 4 are the after save flow automation. I'll do it again. So you can tell a little bit of a difference here. We are still splitting hairs as far as which one is faster. But based on this data, I would lean towards putting a lot of your actions into a single flow. This sort of supports the notion that there's overhead every time you go to launch a new flow interview, that if you can minimize the amount of times that needs to happen, especially when you compare these first 2, it seems like that performs a little bit better. These first 2 are very similar in their configuration. They don't try to use collections to optimize anything. They simply execute the action, and it's 40 to 50 milliseconds difference here as far as which one is faster. How this scales is still to be determined. I'll get into some of the key takeaways here and some further exploration that will need to happen. But what I've gathered from doing this testing is the less elements that need to execute, the faster your flow will run. The fewer flows that need to run, the fewer initialization overhead needs to take place. So that supports the fact of consolidating your after save flows into one instead of having multiple that need to launch in situations where all of your automation is going to need to run. And a really interesting fact I learned is a DML statement is consumed for each batch of 200 records being inserted, updated, or deleted by a flow. I was racking my brain trying to figure out why I was not actually able to get the number of DML statements down, even though I had eliminated one from my flow configuration. And once I turned on more specific debug logs, it sort of made itself evident that when Salesforce is going to update 400 records, they actually do it in 2 separate DML update statements in that flow, which is something I just never knew. Definitely learned that fact through doing this experimentation. I was able to eliminate one of the queries by using loops and collections here in these last 2 configurations, but it seems as though the impact of adding more elements to the canvas and for all of those to need to be bulkified as these 200 records get inserted into the system still ended up taking longer for that flow to process all of those extra elements. Um, I think what needs to happen next is some future investigation on what happens if the automation I am triggering will trigger other automation. Say there was a before save flow on the records that I was creating. Does that have an impact on which way you should organize your flow automation? I mentioned this earlier, the analysis of having a bunch of decisions in your one big flow and some of them don't get executed versus using separate flows with entry criteria. Does that have an impact? Should we think about how often it's going to be that all of our automation needs to take place versus maybe it's a majority of the time there's only one or two things that execute and the others are just simply no ops? So I want to take a look at that. Another fun area to take a look at is synchronous versus asynchronous. Is that going to have an impact? I imagine it will, but that'd be a fun place to do some further experimentation here. And then what suggestions do you have? I mean, is there any other areas where you want to see some head-to-head comparisons on which flow configuration works better, runs faster, or what have you? I see subflows are coming up in the conversation there. That is an excellent area to take a look at. This sort of brings us to the end here. I'm open for questions. You can get in touch with me on Twitter at RealEvanPonter. I'm on LinkedIn at ETPonter, or you can reach out by email, evan@pontersolutions.com. I'm going to take a look through the chat here and see if there's any other questions that have come up. Expected the mega flow to run faster. Apparently the number of flows elements having the largest impact. Yep, that's what I found. The last two are better optimized towards limits. That is correct as far as queries, but it turns out if you are, this is all part of the scenario I was running where I was inserting 200 records and then I was updating what ended up being 400 records. I was not able to get the actual DML statements consumed to be fewer, even though I was using less update elements on my canvas. So very, very interesting once I got into that rabbit hole. And then exactly, I would have expected 2 instead of 4, but again, that's because of the Salesforce runs a DML statement for each batch of 200 records that are being affected. I think that's correct. Yeah, if I had inserted 100 records, then it wouldn't have needed to use 2 batches, or if, up to 200. I ended up doing I'll show you what happened there. So in this, let's look at this one. Where I was consolidating, yeah. I was inserting 200 records, I would create 200 more, and then I would need to update all of them, or 200. I don't even know. It got so weird trying to do this. But it seemed to be an impact where if I was attempting to update and it crossed multiple batches, it would consume multiple DML statements. But yeah, I think we need to do some further testing here, maybe with 100 records, and see if I could actually get those DML statements to be fewer. Any other questions, thoughts? Would you say there should be one flow for before and one for after per object? I think there's a strong argument to have one before save flow for your object. Because the action being executed there is simply assigning values to the triggering record, this data supports that you don't need to have multiple flows running in before save context on a single object. I think the story is a little bit more hairy for after save flows because you could be doing so many other things as far as creating records, updating records, sending email alerts, outbound messages, what have you. There's a lot more to investigate here. These findings support having fewer elements and fewer flows. I mean, that sort of seems logical, right? The less that Salesforce has to do, the faster it's going to run. So all other things being equal, a single flow with the fewest amount of elements possible is going to be faster. I don't think that's realistic uh, for orgs that get more complex, where you might have other considerations as far as DML statements that are being executed or SOQL queries that might need to run. Any idea how we can migrate multiple flows into a single flow? The workflow migration tool seems to create one flow per workflow. That is correct, Gabby. I would say taking some time to migrate your workflow rules to Flow manually is going to give you more benefits than using that migration tool. You'll be able to make some optimizations here. And for, if you want to use the one after save flow per object situation, your flow is going to look a lot like this. It's similar to what Process Builder would look like if you visualized it, where you had a decision to decide if you're going to execute an action, and then you go ahead and execute it. Regardless, if you do that, you route to the next decision. When you use the workflow rule migration tool, it's not going to take all those things into consideration. So I would say just spend some time understanding what decisions you need to make and what actions you need to execute, and try to organize your after save flow similar to this canvas. The performance impact of before save flows is lower than after save, so optimizing by number of before save flows will have minimal impact. Yeah, I would agree with that. Any other thoughts or questions in our remaining 4 minutes here together? Oh, I'll look at the Q&A too. I didn't even see that tab. Okay. See the megaflow using multiple update elements with criteria inside. Oh, that's getting very, very in depth there, but I like it. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind too. Well, if there are no other questions, feel free to reach out, connect with me. I'm always happy to chat about Salesforce, and looking forward to the rest of Automation Dreamin'. Great job to Mark and Vicky for organizing all of this. It's been an incredible 2 days.